the Stargate conspiracy, or StarCon, as we call it occasionally, which, as you notice, is subtitled Revealing the Truth Behind Extraterrestrial Contact, Military Intelligence, and the Mysteries of Ancient Egypt, which is nearly as long as the book itself, but actually does rather cover it. And as we turned our attention to Egypt back in the 1990s, we couldn't help noticing, we got sidetracked. You know, as I say, we didn't, for many years, as it turned out, actually manage to go back and back and back. We got sidetracked by what was going on in 1990s Egypt. Basically, a huge amount of digging at Giza, and what might be called rather blatant, obvious posturing on Giza by several agencies and individuals in the lead up, especially to the millennium. And this was fascinating. It seemed there were all sorts of agendas, all sorts of stuff going on. And although much of what we're about to examine happened then, the story does go on, and the lessons that we learnt, which we are about to share, remain, sadly, all too relevant, and they are as jaw-dropping as ever. There was, as you know, back then, a huge surge in what might be termed alternative Egyptology, almost an Egypt fever around the millennium. We were, in fact, to add to this, but in a very different way. Our book, StarCon, did upset a lot of people. We did not set out to do that, believe me. It did upset a lot of people because, basically, it criticised some of the prominent names in the field. Basically, what we did was we double and triple checked their research in their books, certain big names, with some surprising results, which we set out in Stargate Conspiracy. And although, as I say, we upset the writers and a lot of their readers, a lot of their fans, there are some things which just have to be said. Particularly, one of the things that gripped us, really, floored us, really, was what happens when you claim to come up with answers to ancient mysteries, upon which you then hang a modern message. Or worse, when you actually manipulate the facts to fit in with what is actually a political agenda. Incidentally, by the way, of course, we got called skeptics, among other choice terms, but we're not skeptics in the usual sense at all. For example, we acknowledge a genuine unseen world does exist. More to the point here, we do fully admit that there are such things as ancient mysteries. Mysteries about the ancient past, absolutely. But as an aside, StarCon, as it turned out, wasn't the wisest career move. Although it was published by one of the biggest international publishers, Little Brown, we ended up being blacklisted as a direct result of intervention by some of the big names we had criticised. And if you think that's not very much, let me say that we were blacklisted in 1999, and we still are, by many of those big name publishers, for one specific reason. Anyway, StarCon. We were always suspicious of those who claim to have the answers, the whole answers, to the great mysteries of the past, or claim to be in touch with great spiritual power, or claim to be the arbiters of the whole truth. And it's very interesting, the psychology involved. Once people are excited, and nothing is potentially as exciting, of course, as an alleged contact with the gods, or with alien gods, maybe, people will go that extra mile with you into territory they would otherwise never even consider or even shun. Once you've convinced them that you know magic, that you have contact with the ancient gods, that you know when the ancient gods are going to arrive, people will stick with you no matter what. I mean, you have created a cult. And I stand here and I know what I'm talking about because I used to be a Mormon missionary. So, I mean, I know about cults. I know how they operate. This whole idea of manipulation of ideas, half-facts, beliefs, is what we believe some people were and are attempting to do, only using a belief in contact with ancient, advanced extraterrestrials, the gods of the ancient world, who, according to the belief system, created human civilization, perhaps even created the human race itself, perhaps again through genetic engineering or manipulation, and who've watched over us ever since, and who are coming back to save us from ourselves, essentially. And there are, though, this whole scenario, lessons to be learnt from history. Take, for example, the belief in Atlantis. Now, I'm not talking about a geographical place, the sunken island. A belief that it existed is straightforward enough. But I am talking about its associations with a lost, spiritually advanced race in contact with advanced extraterrestrial beings, for example. All that is incredibly potent. It has the potential for being used, whether these things are true or not. Now, one bunch of people who did love Atlantis, the Nazis, and you'll see obviously Hitler, and this here is Rudolf Hess, his deputy, his very mystically minded deputy. Now, the existence of Atlantis was a central feature of the mystical ideas promoted by the Nazis. And obviously, we are not saying anybody who has spiritual ideas connected with Atlantis is a closet Nazi. That is just ridiculous. We're not saying that. But we're saying that if you have to be very careful about the way potent ideas are manipulated, or at the very beginning, even presented. If you specifically, bearing all that in mind, look at what was used by one particular cult connected with, albeit you might think tangentially, but connected with the Giza, what was going on at Giza. In October 1994, there were the mass suicides, or perhaps murders, of 53 members of the Solar Temple cult. And sadly, that's the fruit of their labours there. They apparently believed that their souls would be transported to their true home in Sirius, which is, of course, all sadly par for the course for a modern cult. But there was a twist, and it was a twist that was very contemporary with the end of the 1990s. They explicitly linked Rudolf Gantenbrink's discovery of a door to a secret chamber in the Great Pyramid the previous year with their deaths. The discovery of Gantenbrink's door they saw as being, figuratively, the door, the trigger for them to go off and let their souls fly free. Now, obviously, and as you probably know, the whole Gantenbrink thing was brought to the public attention by Robert Bauval. Now, obviously, we are not blaming either Bauval or Gantenbrink for what happened to the cult. But it does show how careful we have to be when it comes to speculations about secret chambers and great ancient secrets, when we tip over from fact into belief, when we tip over and we invite people to share their own mystical experiences and conflate everything together. It pays to unravel these often complex connections, as Clive will explain. But first, we want to know why, actually, did the Solar Temple have a thing about Sirius? The unraveling, as I say, it's all very complicated. The unraveling begins. This is Alice Bailey, as a lot of you might know. She's really the creator, the inspirer of the New Age. She was a channeler whose great contact with the other world was someone called a spirit called the Tibetan, a master. Many of her teachings, however, were appallingly racist and anti-Semitic, even by the standards of her day. Perhaps the worst example is what she blithely presented to her followers, obviously which came via her spirit guide, the Tibetan. She talked about the Americans' bombing of atomic bombing of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and she said that in fact it was essentially all part of life's rich pattern. It was the process of healing the yellow root race whose time was over out of this world to make way for others. So that's all right then. She also taught, interestingly, that Freemasonry was the terrestrial version of an initiatory school that exists on Sirius, presumably meaning one of the planets in the system, and that Freemasonry was founded by beings from Sirius. Now, significantly, her husband, Foster Bailey, was, guess what, a prominent Freemason. And he introduced her ideas, including ideas about Sirius, into the Brotherhood. Now, by the way, when Clive died talking about Freemasonry, we're not saying it's a good or a bad thing, we're just saying this is what happened. So it was obviously Alice Bailey's husband was a Freemason, and he introduced ideas, her ideas, into Freemasonry. Fact. And then there's this guy, Schwaller de Lubicz, the godfather of the alternative Egypt genre. All the major writers on the subject, Graham Hancock, Robert Bauval, Robert Temple, cite Schwaller de Lubicz, his work on ancient Egypt with respect and admiration. And John Anthony West's seminal book, Serpent in the Sky, 1979, was actually written specifically to bring Schwaller's ideas about ancient Egypt to a popular audience. And it was West's desire, actually, to prove Schwaller right, essentially, that led him to get Robert Schoch involved in, that whole business of studying the water erosion on the Sphinx. And it was that research that, more than anything, triggered the explosion of interest in ancient Egypt when it did, in the lead up to the millennium. This seemingly provided evidence that the Sphinx is much older than conventional history admits, thereby, in Westview, proving Schwaller right. Although it did actually prove him just as wrong, since Schwaller and West thought that the erosion was from a single gigantic flood, not centuries of drip, drip, drip rainfall erosion. And Schoch's evidence was also tweaked by Graham Hancock to support the 10,500 BC idea, and ditto with Bauval and Orion, which all sort of works, but what doesn't fit in with all this insistence is that it fits the stars in 10,500 BC. And if you want to know all the details of all of that, it's obviously in the book. But about Schwaller de Lubicz, what none of these writers say is that his politics was so far to the right that they crossed the border into fascism. He was racist, virulently anti-Semitic, and also believed that women were intellectually inferior to men. All of that you might think, well, it was in the old days, that's what people thought. No, even by the standards of the day. And it appears that his work on ancient Egypt and the priesthood was actually heavily influenced by his political ideas and racial ideas, actually. For example, Schwaller declared that there were no blacks ever in power in ancient Egypt. And also, he changed the famous French rallying cry of liberty, equality, fraternity. He said, no, let's change that. Let's have liberty, hierarchy, and fraternity. In other words, ruled by an elite. Not in itself very shock horror, perhaps. And it must be said in all fairness that one shouldn't judge people by who they happen to inspire. That would be ridiculous. But if people buy into ideas because they share a mindset, that is very telling. And Schwaller's views gelled so readily with those of the Nazis that particularly Rudolf Hess, who we were looking at, Hitler's deputy, basically they took one of his designs, then used it for one of their uniforms, And they particularly admired him. They talked about him a lot. But the thing that is even more damning, if it can be more damning than being a proto-Nazi, was that Schwaller de Lubicz was actually a synerchist. And synerchists are the most successful, perhaps, certainly the most sinister and dangerous secret society that Europe has ever seen. And as demonstrated by his rallying cry, which included the word hierarchy, it's about rule by an elite from behind the scenes, all white, all men like him, of course, and all in our book. Our point is not that those authors in 1990s who expressed such admiration for him were similarly sinister. I mean, again, that's ridiculous. But, perhaps they could have told us the whole story about him, so we could make up our own minds about whether to find him admirable or not. The main agenda behind many of the prominent writings around the millennium was actually to prove Edgar Casey right. Now, please don't run away. I am not going to say that Edgar Casey was a Nazi. He wasn't. He was a lovely bloke. As we know, he was a very talented healer and psychic. When he actually established his reputation as a healer, he attracted the interest of American politicians and military chiefs, and he was a personal friend of the then US head of the Secret Service. And he was also called on for advice by President Woodrow Wilson. No one knows why, which is a bit sad, intriguing. It could be for personal healing reasons, or there's a rumor that Wilson wanted him to help with the setting up of the League of Nations, which would have been brilliant. Edgar Casey is now, of course, most famous for his psychic readings about the ancient past and the history of the human race, most famously how the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx were made by survivors from Atlantis around the year 10,500 BC, and his prophecies about the future. And one of his prophecies that's received the most attention in recent years relates to the Hall of Records, the chamber allegedly containing the secrets of Atlantis that was supposed to lie beneath the Sphinx at Giza. Casey predicted it would be discovered and opened in 1998, and that this event would mark the beginning of a new age for humankind. I mean, think of the potential. If someone convinced us that they had entered the Hall of Records and knew its secrets. I mean, wow. Some of Cayce's prophecies, actually, also had a political context, which is sometimes lost on us today, and it's very important. For example, 1943, he predicted that by 1968, China would become Christian. Well, it would become a democracy, actually. Then it would be converted to Christianity. I mean, it does seem crazy, and of course it never happened, but it does need to be seen in the context of the time he made the prediction, and also what else was going on kind of around him then. During the 1930s and 40s, there was a serious political movement in the United States that aimed to Christianize China. It was a campaign, it was a sort of crusade. Although this might seem to be somewhat unrealistic, it did have some very high-level support, including from the Vice President Henry Wallace, Roosevelt's Vice President in the 1940s. So Cayce's prediction fitted in with that campaign, that very high-level campaign. And you have to wonder, is that why he made it? To encourage support for it? Is it that way round? And Cayce's prediction about the opening of the Hall of Records also fits, actually, with Henry Wallace's ideas. Casey said that this would happen in 1998 and would be the trigger for world-changing events. Most importantly, it would mark the coming of the Master of the World, which many believe meant the second coming of Christ, and the emergence of a new root race. And he also said that this would bring in an age when, and I quote, true Americanism would be the dominant power in the world, which he defined as American values governed by the principles of Freemasonry. Obviously, that would somewhat appeal to American Freemasons. Now, that's Henry Wallace. And of course, all of that appears to fit very much with the ideas of Henry Wallace, a prominent Freemason. And he's a very interesting character. He was a vice president of Roosevelt. He was deeply interested in the esoteric. He was a theosophist, a committed Freemason. He was responsible for the eye and the triangle symbol being placed on the American dollar bills, which is actually the reverse side of the Great Seal of the United States, which many people believe to be a Masonic symbol, although it probably wasn't originally. But the point is that, maybe this way around, that even American Freemasons, including Wallace, came to believe it was a Masonic symbol. He had a particular interpretation of the meaning. He said it represented the moment when the missing capstone would be returned to the Great Pyramid, signaling the beginning of a time when America would become the dominant power in the world. And this is a quote from Wallace's book. It will take a more definite recognition of the grand architect of the universe before the apex stone is finally fitted in place, and this nation, in the full strength of its power, is in position to assume leadership among the nations in inaugurating the new order of the ages. And this refers, of course, to linking a missing capstone on the Great Pyramid, but that's what Cayce did too. Cayce also linked his new age to be triggered by the opening of the Hall of Records and the triumph of Freemasonry and true Americanism, with the placing of the golden capstone on the Great Pyramid. Now, of course, Cayce's ideas, Wallace's ideas, are so similar that they can't be coincidence, but who got it from whom? So there are actual big questions. Were Cayce's prophecies shaped, perhaps subconsciously, by the then current political agendas such as Wallace's, or was he shaping his prophecies to fit them? The point is, of course, that once a prophecy has been made, those who believe in them can ensure they happen. You probably all do remember that the millennium was to have been marked in Egypt by, guess what, the lowering of a golden capstone onto the top of the Great Pyramid by helicopter, while an image of the Eye of Horus was projected onto the side of the pyramid with lasers. This would, of course, have fulfilled exactly Cayce's prophecies, and it would have been the moment that they talked about, Wallace and Cayce. We now know, of course, the ceremony didn't happen. The Egyptian government, who had been okay with it, discovered the Masonic connections. And as Freemasonry is banned in Egypt, they cancelled the ceremony. So in that sense, the prophecy did not happen, America did not triumph. We have to say that that was in part due to the Stargate conspiracy, but this is only part of the story which Clive will continue to unravel. And now I'm going to be unmiked publicly.
Oh, right, thank you. Don't worry, I'm not going to say Illuminati. Yeah. The point is, from that image and what Lynn was talking about with Wallace's interpretation of this symbol, and what Edgar Casey said, is that these kind of things do have political connotations, political implications. But Lynn and I were interested when Henry Wallace's name came up in connection with Edgar Casey, because we knew about him in another context. Henry Wallace, as Lynn said, was President Roosevelt's vice president during Roosevelt's second term, so it's 1940 to 44. He was actually a member of Roosevelt's cabinet throughout Roosevelt's presidency, and it was during that period that he did the dollar bill thing. But of course, Wallace narrowly lost the vice presidential nomination to Harry Truman when Roosevelt went for a third term, and of course, if he hadn't lost that nomination and been vice president, he would have actually become president when Roosevelt died in office in 1945. But as I say, we knew about him in another context, because in the late 1940s and early 50s, Henry Wallace funded an interesting setup in the state of Maine called the Round Table Foundation, and this is a picture of where it was based in Maine. I should actually say partly funded, but I'll come back to that. Now, the Round Table Foundation was set up to conduct research into parapsychology. And it was the idea of this guy, who's a medical doctor named Andrea Puharich. And as I say, it was set up to do basically laboratory research into extrasensory perception and similar things. And also brought in some of the most famous mediums and psychics of the time. For example, the Irish medium Eileen Garrett and a Dutch clairvoyant who was very well known at the time called Peter Herkos. So they were brought into the laboratory to be studied. But although the lab was kind of set up on scientific principles, it was, as Puharich acknowledged, very much based on and oriented towards the teachings of Alice Bailey, who Lynn talked about earlier, a very influential New Age teacher. The Round Table Foundation was actually astonishingly well connected at the very top levels of American society, because not only did it have the patronage of a former vice president, it included members of some of the leading families, the richest families in the States. For example, this is a lady called Alice Bouverie, who was actually a member of the Astor family, one of the great blue blood families of America. She was very involved in the Round Table Foundation's work. Another very key figure who helped Puharich set the place up and became kind of his second in command there was this guy, inventor and philosopher Arthur Young, who I'm sure many of you know about. Arthur Young was essentially the inventor of the Bell helicopter, and that invention had made him a fortune. And he used that fortune to pursue his own interest in spiritual philosophies and spiritual matters. And Arthur Young was actually married into the Forbes family, so again, one of the leading, wealthiest families in the States. He was married to Ruth Forbes, who was also very involved in the foundation's work. Now, there are two ways of telling the next part of the story. But first of all, I'll tell it the way it's supposed to be told, if you like, the official version, the way the people involved wanted it to be told. And what happened was that in the end of 1952, the Round Table Foundation was working with another a psychic and mystic, an Indian named Dr. Vinod. And they brought him into the laboratory and were studying him. But one day he began to channel. And he began to channel two entities who said that they were actual representatives of what they called the Nine, or the Nine Principles, and sometimes the Nine Principles of God. A couple of significant points in the way these entities presented themselves through Vinod. I'm not making any kind of judgment on whether these entities were real or coming out of Vinod's subconscious. I'll talk about them as if they're what they claim to be. First of all, these two entities called themselves simply by initials. They called themselves R and M. Now, Alice Bailey, in her earlier teachings, had, from this entity that she called the Tibetan, had taught that when the New Age was about to happen, it would be heralded in by the appearance of two masters, and they were going to be called the Masters R and the Master M. So clearly there was a connection between Alice Bailey's teaching and what Vinod was channeling, and it would have been very obvious to Puharich and Arthur Young, who were very much into Alice Bailey. So that's one point. The second point is that the term 9 principles has a particular significance in terms of the theories of Schwaller de Lubicz. As I'm sure everyone here will know, the ancient Egyptian religion of Heliopolis, the one which inspired the building of the Giza pyramids, centered on a group of 9 gods, which are known as the Great Ennead, group of 9, who are headed by the creator god Atum, and the other 8 gods, which includes familiar deities such as Isis and Osiris, are essentially seen as manifestations of Atum. Now, the ancient Egyptian word that is usually translated as God is Netta, but Schwaller de Lubicz translated it instead. He translated Netta as principle. And as far as we've been able to establish, he was the first person, and really in some ways the only person, to have done that. So these entities describing themselves as emissaries of the 9 principles or the 9 principles of God seems to be a specific reference not only to the Great Ennead of Heliopolis, but also to be specifically drawn from Schwaller de Lubicz's work. His work, in which he had that translation, incidentally, had been recently published just a couple of years earlier, although at that point they were only available in French. And then what happened is, for the next 6 months, until Dr. Vinod returned to India, I think regularly, once a week, a group was gathered, a group of 9 people, to hear the 9's kind of wisdom being channeled through Vinod. This group obviously included Puharich and Arthur and Ruth Young and Alice Bouverie, possibly Henry Wallace, though we don't know for sure. Henry Wallace certainly visited the foundation, but the thing is, the identities of most of this group of 9 that met to listen to the channeling has always been kept secret. Similarly, what was actually said, very little of what was actually said during those sessions has ever been published. So, as I say, that went on for 6 months, just another kind of sitter group around a channeler, really. And then after that, the Round Table Foundation carried on its business until 1958, when its members, Puharich disbanded the organisation, and its members went their own separate ways. Throughout the 1960s, Puharich really had a double career. He was an inventor of medical devices, but he also established an international reputation as a parapsychologist, most famously studying a Brazilian psychic surgeon, Arrigo. But that was to pale into insignificance in 1971, because Puharich became the person who discovered Uri Geller. That's Puharich. You see, the 60s had happened to Puharich. He'd changed a bit. What happened was Puharich went to Tel Aviv in 1971 to evaluate Geller, and then he brought him back to the USA for testing at the California Research Institute called SRI International. But pretty much as soon as Puharich met Uri in Israel, he hypnotized him. And he hypnotized him in order to try and find out where Geller's abilities came from. And what happened was that when he put Geller into a hypnotic trance, Geller started to channel. He started to channel something he was called Spectra, which claimed to be a conscious computer aboard a spaceship somewhere out in the cosmos. But Puharich, for some reason that's not really apparent, suggested that there might be a connection to the 9 principles he'd been in touch with 20 years before. And Spectra immediately agreed there was, and said it was actually the 9 who had programmed Uri Geller with his powers when Geller was a small child. And through Geller, the Nine alerted Puharich to what they said was his life's mission, which was to use Geller's talents to alert the world to an imminent mass landing of spaceships. That would bring representatives of the Nine. But that didn't really work out, because after Geller was taken to the States and began appearing on the media and quickly became an international psychic superstar, in 1973 he bowed out of this, turned his back on it completely, and Puharich had to find other channels, which he did. He found a series of other psychics, none of whom lasted very long, before finally he settled on an American psychic and healer named Phyllis Schlemmer, and this is she. Phyllis Schlemmer had been a medium since she was a child, a kind of traditional spiritualist medium, and she had a spirit guide whose name was Tom, and she assumed this was the spirit of her deceased grandfather. But after she met Puharich and Puharich hypnotized her, Tom suddenly announced that he had been an extraterrestrial all the time, and he was, of course, an emissary of the Nine. So we can see a pattern here. Puharich would come across people who already claimed to be in contact with some kind of Discarna entity, hypnotize them, and suggest that their entity was really a messenger for the Nine. And that suggestion would invariably be taken up. There are several other examples of him doing this with psychics. So it does raise the question of whether Puharich was actually stage managing the whole thing. Schlemmer wasn't the Nine's only channel. There was a whole network of psychics in touch with them, but she was kind of the main one, the official one, what the Nine called their transceiver. And we basically had at that point what was a rerun of what had happened at the Round Table Foundation 20 years before. Puharich set up an establishment in Ossining, New York, that was called Lab 9, and gathered a group of people, disciples if you like, who would gather regularly to hear what Tom had to say through their transceiver. At this time, the Nine actually started calling themselves the Council of Nine, which is the name by which they became best known in kind of New Age circles. And again, this group that was gathered around to listen to the channeling was a pretty impressive bunch. It included multimillionaire businessmen, including members of Canada's richest family, the Bronfmans. It had members of European nobility. It had leading New Age and alternative writers, people like Lyle Watson. It had scientists from SRI International. At least one prominent political figure who was a personal friend of then President Gerald Ford, but whose name is kept out of the records. But even bigger than that, one of the members of this circle that used to sit and listen to the Nine was Gene Roddenberry, creator, of course, of Star Trek. Another key player in Lab 9 was this guy, Dr. James J. Hurtak. James J. Hurtak, who I'm sure many of you know about, and probably actually some know. He was appointed by the Nine as Puharich's second in command, so a similar role to Arthur Young's in the earlier Round Table Foundation. Now, in fact, Hurtak claims to have been in independent contact with the Nine since 1973, when he says they programmed him with mystical awareness and incredible knowledge of the cosmos, all of which he put into a book, which is there, called The Keys of Enoch, or the Book of Knowledge, which, is a very kind of Bible-looking tome. But when you actually read The Keys of Enoch, it's very clear it owes a lot to Alice Bailey. It uses a lot of the concepts and the terminology and the kind of system of the way the universe is organised that came from Alice Bailey's writing. So it's essentially an update of Bailey with a bit more sciencey, really. But during the channeling sessions at Lab 9, this entity, Tom, in fact, in answer to a question by Gene Roddenberry, finally revealed his true identity and that of the Nine themselves. Tom claimed he was actually not Tom, but Atum, the creator god of the religion of Heliopolis, and the Nine were none other than the great Ennead of that religion. However, as we've seen, there were clues about this from the start, such as the use of Schwaller de Lubicz's term 9 principles, and certainly signs Puharich had known about this all along, right from the beginning. So what was the Nine's message as it emerged from their various channels? Well, it's they're advanced extraterrestrial beings or intelligences from Sirius, of course, who created the human species and had a profound influence on the origins of human civilization, in particular that of Egypt. They claimed a special association with Giza. According to Tom, there are secret chambers under the Giza pyramids that can be accessed from beneath the Sphinx. Obviously not the first to come out with that idea. They also say that the Nine have watched over humanity ever since, in particular guiding our religions. They claim to be behind all the world's religions except one, which I'll come to. And they say that this is a particularly critical moment in Earth's history, and they're about to return to put right what's gone wrong. And all of this is set against an apocalyptic background of a cosmic war between the forces of light and darkness. However, even with such impressive contacts, both terrestrial and extraterrestrial, things didn't go that well for Lab 9. It broke up in 1978 after a series of unfortunate events that culminated in an arson attack on the Ossining estate. Puharich fled to Mexico saying that his life was in danger from the CIA. He came back to the States 2 years later saying he'd done some kind of deal with the CIA. And he doesn't seem to have played any further part in the Nine story from then until his death about 15 years later. But, so far it all seems very exciting, doesn't it? The gods of ancient Egypt, or the beings once worshipped as gods, our creators, our protectors, re-establishing contact, bringing revelations about our origins and our destiny. And initially, when Lynn and I began piecing this story together, that's what they thought. That's what we thought. Maybe something's really going on here. But the story I've just told you is the story as it was presented to the public through Puharich's books and works such as The Only Planet of Choice. The story of the Nine, the story as the Nine, or their human representatives, wanted it to be told. And as usual, Lynn and I looked behind the story, especially at the parts that we weren't being told. And what we found puts quite a different light on these events. The central figure in this drama was, of course, Puharich. Here he is back in the 1950s again. Throughout his career, he had very close links with the US military and intelligence community. He was actually got his medical training in the US Army, but was given a medical discharge in 1947, after which he established the Round Table Foundation. But the evidence is, very strong evidence, is that this medical discharge was really just a cover to allow him to set up what was an apparently civilian research institution where he could study individuals, mediums and psychics, who wouldn't have been comfortable being taken into a military facility to be put in one of their laboratories. Research, ours and that of other people, has established that in addition to private sponsorship by the likes of Henry Wallace, the Round Table Foundation was funded by the US Army. Also, the building and lands that it was in were actually given to Puharich by the US Navy. Even in his own account of events at the Foundation, Puharich refers to visits by high-ranking Army officers, specifically from the Army's psychological warfare section. More than that, right in the middle of those first contacts with the Nine, Puharich was redrafted into the Army. What happened was, in late 52, about a month before the first contact with the Nine, Puharich delivered a paper to the Pentagon The paper was entitled An Evaluation of the Possible Usefulness of Extrasensory Perception in Psychological Warfare. And the very next day, after going to the Pentagon and delivering that paper, an order was signed redrafting him into the army with the rank of captain. The fact he was redrafted gives the game away that his medical discharge some years earlier was just a cover story. So for the next 3 years, Puharich served at the US Army's Chemical Weapons Center in Maryland, which is that, continuing his work at the Round Table Foundation during his leave. And while he was away, it was Arthur Young who took over running the foundation and therefore running the 9 channeling sessions. The Chemical Weapons Center, where Puharich was stationed, wasn't only, as its name might suggest, concerned with chemical and biological warfare, but it was also the Army's main facility for psychological warfare. And that's what Puharich was working on. In particular, he was experimenting with, among other things, the effects of LSD, other hallucinogenic substances, particularly those used by Mexican shaman, which was part of a joint project between the Army and the CIA. And that project was in turn part of the CIA's notorious MK-Ultra program, its so-called mind control program. Now, all that puts a rather different complexion on the 9 contacts that Puharich was running at exactly the same time. Puharich's connections with the intelligence community continued after the 1950s. He was involved in the ESP research, which included remote viewing at SRI International, which it was later revealed was initiated and funded by the CIA, and it was the CIA who sent Puharich to Israel to evaluate Uri Geller and bring him back to SRI for testing. SRI crop up again and again in this story, sometimes in very unexpected places. SRI, Stanford Research Institute. It's a scientific research organisation that, from its establishment in the late 1960s, when it was basically spun out of Stanford University, has always been a major contractor to the US government and in particular to the US defence and intelligence agencies. So earlier I mentioned Puharich's apparent stage managing of the 9 contacts through hypnosis. So was the whole 9 thing, the whole council of 9 things, some kind of experiment by Puharich on behalf of the military and intelligence community? And if so, why? To what end? The story didn't end with Puharich. Phyllis Schlemmer continued channeling the 9 and continued until her death just 4 years ago. In 1992, a book of their channeling, based on sessions from the 1950s onwards, called The Only Planet of Choice, came out and became a New Age bestseller. And as you can see, it has a front cover endorsement by James Hurtak. Hurtak himself went on to bigger and better things, travelling the world, giving workshops on his own book of inspired revelations, The Keys of Enoch, as he's still doing. And the 9, or rather those who claimed to represent them, continued to have a hotline to the top levels of American society and political establishment. Individuals connected with the circle around the 9 even had some influence over Al Gore when he was vice president. And Al Gore, of course, nearly became president, a bit like Henry Wallace before. So maybe we should be grateful that George W. won the election in 2000. Only joking. So if the 9 contacts were the result of some kind of manipulation, clearly that manipulation continued after Puharich left the scene. So maybe all that involvement of his with psychological warfare and agencies such as the CIA, was it just a coincidence? Or did the 9 choose to make contact with him because he had those connections? Well, it comes down to the question of whether the 9 really were what they claimed to be, the gods of ancient Egypt. And sadly, perhaps, it seems they're not. The 9's knowledge of ancient Egypt seems to derive more from the works of Alice Bailey, Edgar Casey, and Schwaller de Lubicz than it does from archaeology or Egyptology. That doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, of course, but the 9 have made some very basic errors in their account of history, I don't have time to go into, but they're in the book, which really call their claims into question. A lot of what the Nine said, particularly some of its kind of racial ideas and its religious ideas, are kind of quite worrying. For example, there's a distinct anti-Islamic theme in the Nine material. Tom declared that the religion of Islam is under the influence of what he called the Fallen One, which is the leader of the cosmic forces of darkness. Hurtak's Keys of Enoch also labels Muslims children of darkness and speaks of the Kaaba stone in Mecca as being the embodiment of the universe's forces of negativity. All very worrying, particularly in today's world. And all the more worrying as from the late 70s, there was a real concerted, orchestrated effort which gathered momentum as the millennium approached to sell the Nine and their message, both to powerful individuals and to a wider audience, using apparently independent discoveries, archaeological, historical, and scientific, that appeared to back the Nine's claims up. It's actually surprising how much in the alternative history field can be traced back to people who were part of that group around the Nine. Earlier I talked about Arthur Young, Hugh Harwich's second in command at the Round Table Foundation, who, after that foundation was closed down, set up his own, the Foundation for the Study of Consciousness in Philadelphia. In the mid-1960s, Young became a mentor to a young student named Robert Temple, who actually became, at the age of 21, the secretary of Young's foundation. I'm sure everyone in this room will know who Robert Temple is. The author of the classic 1976 book, The Sirius Mystery. In some ways, the book that really started it all. It was actually Arthur Young who inspired Robert Temple to write that book. It was Young who, in the mid-1960s, first brought Temple's attention to the central mystery, the mystery of the Dogon of Mali, and their apparently advanced information about the star Sirius, and who encouraged him to write it. So we have Arthur Young to thank for the Sirius Mystery, which is a book that seemed to provide independent academic support for Alice Bailey's channeled teachings about the influence of beings from Sirius on the human past, on the ancient past. But Arthur Young was a follower of Alice Bailey, so maybe it's not such a coincidence after all. James Hurtak became a major player in events in the search for hidden chambers at Giza, particularly beneath the Sphinx, from the mid-70s through to the 90s. In the 70s, working with a team from SRI International. Hurtak's ideas came to influence writers such as Graham Hancock and Robert Bauval. You'll find him referenced and quoted in them as an authority, without any mention that he claims to have a hotline to the gods of Egypt. This is Hurtak and Robert Bauval at an event in California last year. Now, I've heard the bell, so I know that I'm running short of time, so I do have to skip the next bit, I'm afraid. It was also about how something else that was brought into this sort of unfolding drama in the 80s and 90s, the famous Face on Mars, all that can be traced back to people that were part of the Nine Circle. Hurtak was a major player in publicising that, so I'm having to skip the detail here to keep to time. So basically we find all these different disparate strands of belief about the ancient past, and particularly its connection with places, extraterrestrial connections with places like Sirius and Mars, all seem to be drawn together more and more tightly as the millennium approached. And what seemed to us was that any discoveries that were being made were being spun, often quite shamelessly, to make them fit or appear to fit theories and pronouncements of people like Schwaller de Lubicz and Edgar Casey. And we could, it seemed to us that a trail was being led that would ultimately lead people from those discoveries to the Nine, and therefore to those who claimed to be in touch with them and speak for them. That's what made Lynn and I want to write the Stargate conspiracy, to bring the full story, including the hidden parts, to the attention of people who were getting excited by, for example, Hancock and Bovell's books. And we think that our book did its job, because by making these connections public, we kind of burst a bubble that was being built up, kind of took the wind out of our sails, because we could see that at some point, this was all heading towards a point where somebody was going to come out with a big reveal and say that this all proved what the Nine had been saying all along was true. Therefore, we should listen to the people that claim to speak for them. We don't think for a moment that's the end of it. Whoever was behind the Nine thing will be trying to find another way of using all that. And I just want to finish by really summarising what Lynn and I are really saying and why we say it. Because after Andy asked us to speak today about Stargate conspiracy, and as we were putting this talk together, we sort of joked between ourselves that our theme should really be, don't believe what you hear at conferences like this. Not even what we say. But no, that's not really what we're saying. The reason we got so concerned about the way these things were and are being manipulated is because we believe at least, that there are genuine mysteries about the ancient world and about the origins of civilization. And researchers like Andy and the others here today are right to be asking the questions and right to be trying to answer them. The danger, we think, comes when people pop up who claim they already have the answers because they've got them through their hotline to the gods. We weren't saying, and we're not saying, as some took it at the time, that all the evidence that conventional history is wrong has been invented in order to create this new belief system and to fool everybody. What we're saying is that all that evidence has been hijacked, it's been spun. Not just the evidence, but actually in some ways the gods of Egypt themselves have been hijacked. So, for example, just to give some examples, Robert Schoch's work on the water erosion of the Sphinx really does present evidence that the Sphinx is much older than the history books say. But, as Lynn said, it doesn't, as claimed by John Anthony West, prove Schwaller de Lubicz right either. Neither does it, as Graham Hancock tried to do in Fingerprints of the Gods, support Edgar Casey's psychic information about Atlantis. Similarly, Robert Bovell's Orion-Giza correlation theory. The basic idea that the Giza pyramids were laid out to reflect the stars of Orion's belt hangs together, makes sense. What doesn't work is Robert Bovell's claim that the pyramids specifically represent Orion's belt as it appeared in 10,500 BC, and therefore supports Cayce's psychic information, because that is easily proven to be wrong. Neither do Lynn and I reject information that comes from channeling or other psychic means. Far from it. We've been around long enough to know better. We've known Andy far too long to think that. But information that comes through those means has to be tested just like any other source of information. Psychics can and do get things wrong. They are only human. And the sources of that channeled information, whatever they are, can and do mislead and manipulate. We shouldn't accept something just because it comes from an unseen source. What we're saying is that we should all be cautious when a message, spiritual, religious, and above all political, is attached to the wonders and mysteries of the ancient world. So I say we shouldn't believe something just because it comes through a psychic, just because it comes from an invisible source. Or for that matter, we shouldn't believe it even if it comes from what claims to be a god or the gods. As I say, we found discoveries that are genuine in themselves and genuinely intriguing and genuinely meaningful, were being hijacked and turned to serve another agenda. So were the works of people like Edgar Casey, or the psychic information of Edgar Casey. They were all being forced to fit this agenda that supported the Nine. And the Egyptian gods themselves, as I said, have been hijacked as part of that process. And that was another thing that really motivated Lynn and I to write this book and to do this research, because one of the things that drove us is the way that the Great Ennead and the religion of Heliopolis, which Lynn and I so respect, and in particular the wisdom of Heliopolis found in texts such as the Pyramid text, was being hijacked and used and abused. So I want to actually end with this image, which is an image of the real Nine. Thank you.